My name is Claire Elizabeth Moran. I'm 34 years old, and I live in a cramped second-floor apartment above a laundromat in Portland, Maine. I work nights as a nurse in an ER 2 towns over, which means coffee has become more of a religion than a habit. My life is quiet by design. Solo dinners, short walks down wet brick sidewalks, and the steady rhythm of work that keeps my hands and my mind busy. Emotionally, I'm a map of old scars. A father who left when I was 12, a brother I raised more than he raised himself, and a habit of believing distance equals safety. Before I dive in, if you're into raw stories that hit hard and don't thread the needle too neatly, please consider subscribing. I don't tell this easily, but maybe someone out there needs to hear it. The funeral was at St. Michael's, an old stone church that smells like mothballs and incense and the sweat of winter coats. It was snowing, the kind of wet, gray snow that turns stoops into a series of slippery decisions. I remember the choir singing a hymn I couldn't focus on, the words blurred into the steady patter of people's breaths and the tiny clicks of heels on marble. The pew where I sat creaked like an old confession. I had come because there was nobody else to come, because being the only face at the back of a hospital room for the last 6 weeks of his life had felt like a debt I didn't know how to refuse. Behind me, my sister Mara and my brother Evan whispered with the kind of venom that leaves you shaking afterward. Mara's perfume masked the hospital antiseptic in my nostrils. Evan kept checking his phone as if a signal could pull him out of the room. They'd both been angry with me for years, angry about choices I had made, choices we all made, choices we survived because we had to survive. Our mother had left before most of us could speak, which is another story of its own. And Dad had made his departure into something permanent and messy. The priest, Father Greg, was a tall man with hands that smelled faintly of soap and cigarettes. He spoke of death with the practiced softness of someone who'd presided over hundreds of funerals. He droned through the standard platitudes until the funeral director tapped his arm and handed him an envelope. "Before we close," Father Greg said, looking down, "Mr. Thomas Moran left a short statement he'd like read aloud." The room leaned in the way made of sorrow and curiosity does. I remember my mouth being dry, the back of my throat scraping like the inside of a winter glove. "It was just a statement," he said. "Nothing legal, but he wanted us to hear it." The choir stopped the hymn and the silence descended. Not the heavy, reverent hush of a prayer, but a thin, brittle hush like the brittle paper of old bills. "Claire," he read, as if I hadn't been sitting there for the past hour. "He left everything to you." The words hit like a punch to the sternum. The air in the church seemed to go viscous, slowed down so I could watch Mara's eyes narrow and Evan's jaw set. There was a murmur, a rise of hot air through the congregation. I felt hands on my shoulder and didn't know whose they were. I felt the old familiar thread of guilt that had run through my life. The idea that whatever happened to us, it was my fault in some roundabout way. The old, small child inside me wanted to ask why, to plead for the reason he chose me, but everything in that church told me to be quiet. "Claire," my brother said right behind me, his voice dangerously soft. "Is this true? You can't take everything." "He promised." "Promises," I said, and my voice came out smaller than I intended. "He promised a lot when he could walk and talk. The man who died hadn't been the same for a long time." There were whispers that suggested lawyering up, that hinted at irregularities. In families, money is less about currency and more about stories. It becomes the script for who did what to whom, and who was owed what. The priest tried to move us forward, but the seed of suspicion was planted that day in the stone cold of the church. It would be watered in the days that followed. If this is resonating with you so far, a like really helps us reach more people. There's a curious, ugly power to that priest's words. No lawyer present, no will read aloud in a sterile office, just a slip of paper and a man's last breath of intention. It set my family's teeth on edge and made everyone look at me as if I were the final chapter of a book they never finished reading. I didn't know then whether the chapter would bring healing or a fire. After the funeral, people clustered in the parish hall around coffee thermoses and cheese trays. I pressed my fingers to a styrofoam cup until my skin went pale and felt like a ghost. Mara cornered me by the door. her face sharp with accusation and pain. "You set this up, didn't you?" she said, voice low and corrosive. "You went back to him. You made him." "Listen," I said, because I'd learned the rhythm of these conversations. "I visited him when he was sick. I sat with him while he slept. That is not the same as setting up a will." Her lip trembled with something that wasn't quite sorrow, not yet. "He left us a mortgage, Claire. He left us emptiness. What does he leave you?" I didn't have an answer that satisfied the hollow space in her chest or mine. All I had was the faint memory of a man trying to apologize for a lifetime of selfishness in ways that were too late, and a palpable sense that the priest's words had turned a dirge into a courtroom. That was the first day of the trial. The rest would not come with a gavel but with conversations in lawyers' offices, with papers that smelled of toner and law firm beige, with a slow algebra of relationship and obligation. The following week felt like navigation through a dream where every person you meet has an ulterior motive. The town seemed to take sides without asking me. The hospital where I worked hummed with fluorescent light and the indifferent beeping of monitors, which somehow felt more honest than the murmured meetings in my father's kitchen. I found myself replaying the last months I'd spent sitting by Thomas Moran's bed. The way he smelled of whiskey and menthol cigarettes and antiseptic, the way his hands twitched as if trying to reach for a past that wasn't there. We grew up on the edge of an industrial town that smelled of frying oil and river rot. Our house was a place of thin carpets and colder nights, where Dad's absences were as regular as the heat kicking on. My mother left when I was 10, and I have a visceral, physical memory of the door closing like a punctuation mark in the middle of a sentence we never finished. Dad swore she'd left for good reasons. Reasons involving groceries and grocery lists, but the truth, as it so often is, was messier and more human than anything tidy. I used to lay awake, listening to Dad's footsteps and the occasional muffled argument on late-night television. When I was 12 he left. He didn't leave a note that night, just a pile of unpaid car bills and the quiet. Evan was 10. Mara was 16 and angry in the way older sisters often are toward things they can't control. Without thinking much beyond survival, I became the adult. I juggled scholarships and part-time jobs while Evan learned how to fill a bowl of cereal and forget about schoolwork. Mara left for a city 4 hours away with a backpack and a streak of resentment, promising to return but never coming back for long. I came back into Dad's life chipped and wary when I was 29. He'd come back to town after a string of arrests, and his last wife, if you could call her that, left him at a hospital-clinic hybrid in the next town over. It started with a call from the nurse. "There's a Thomas Moran here asking if anyone knows his daughter's number." I remember my chest turning cold like the back of a refrigerator. Something in me recognized the familiar, terrible ache of wanting to fix a thing you couldn't fix without breaking yourself. I spent the last 6 weeks of his life at his bedside. He could barely string a sentence together. His apologies were fragmented, little shards of regret he arranged like a mosaic of shame. He spoke of boats with wrong names and of a girl he once missed. Sometimes he didn't know me, and sometimes he would squeeze my hand with a clarity that cut through my grief like a blade. "I'm sorry, Claire," he'd whisper, as if his lungs were an accountant tallying up debts. "You shouldn't have had to." "You didn't have to," I would tell him, because lying felt kinder than the rest of the truth. Mara accused me of being manipulated. "He used you to die in peace," she hissed over the phone one morning, waking me from a half-sleep where the fluorescent hospital light pressed against my eyelids. "That's all this is. He used you, and now he leaves you what? His mess." Evan's presence was more volatile. He was furious about everything. His fists were the kind that had once smashed plates against the wall, and suddenly, money became the only thing he could imagine as currency for his hurt. "Why would he pick you?" he asked me once during one of our rare, honest conversations. We sat on the back steps of our childhood home, where the paint had peeled like old scabs. "Maybe because I visited," I said more softly than I felt. "Maybe because I sat there when he couldn't speak or pay for his meds." He spat out a laugh that did not contain humor. "Because you were easier to control than us," he said. "Because you were the one who stayed and took the pain." That cut. It landed in a place I had bandaged for years, a tiny economy of self-worth where I measured love by how much inconvenience it caused me. The truth is, I visited him with the same tangled motives everyone visits someone with. A hunger for closure, a need for forgiveness, a mix of resentment and duty. I had a complicated relationship with him, like everyone I loved when love was a strategy for survival. The day I went to the lawyer's office, the winter light fell through blinds and made lines on the table like ledger marks. Susan Blake, a woman with a stern bun and a kindness built into her legalese, showed me a few documents. Mr. Moran had a will drafted 2 years ago, she said. It names you as sole beneficiary and executor. There are clauses, specific dispositions, then a directive. She pushed a folded letter across the table, older than the will, the ink a little smudged. I unfolded it with fingers that were too steady. My name was written in a slant that could only be his, clumsy and uneven like someone trailing behind time. Claire, he had written, I know I am the reason the house missed its laughter. I am the man who left. There are things you don't know. I don't expect forgiveness. I only hope you will use this to do what I could not. Dad. There were pages, longer in different handwriting, letters he'd written over the years. Reading them felt like picking at a scab that had a faint pulse underneath. They weren't excuses. They were explanations that often made little sense. He'd been ashamed of leaving for reasons he didn't fully name. He'd been ashamed of his own failure. He'd written about debts he had settled in small, secret ways, sending money to a woman in Ohio, paying for a child's school fees until he couldn't afford it anymore. It was messy, like him, human and infuriating. People will assume undue influence, Susan said, like it was a spell that conjured lawyers. Coordinator of a will becomes a target, especially when there are estranged heirs. It felt like the law could smell where the heart had been prodded. And the family, Mara and Evan, began to talk loudly about justice, about how the estate should be split. They were talking about mortgages and college funds and the small, pragmatic things that money buys. I was thinking about his letters, the way his handwriting flickered like a pulse across time. Somewhere in the middle of these arguments, my own feelings, grief, confusion, a desire for retribution, were clubbed into something less articulate. If this resonates with you, feel free to share your story in the comments. I'm reading everything. The weeks that followed were a slow unpeeling of our family's past, and an unsettling realization that forgiving him wouldn't be the end of the story. It would be the beginning of a very different kind of work. The legal battles began without gavels. Instead, they were made of appointments and mailed notices, of cardboard boxes filled with old receipts and clogged email threads. My siblings hired a lawyer who smelled of cologne and certainty. He sat with his hands steepled like a judge and told us that contesting a will was messy and emotionally expensive, exactly the kind of thing that eats families alive. You were present in the final months, Mara's lawyer said to me one day, eyes sharp as glass. There are witnesses who can claim undue influence. A will made under the sway of a dying man's guilt is questionable. I wanted to scream. Dad tried to reconcile, I said, and my words felt small between the leather chairs. He wanted me there. I didn't manipulate anyone. I held his hand when he couldn't hold it for himself. She looked at me with a kind of pity that feels a lot like accusation. That's precisely the problem, she said flatly. Evan had already started to drink the way old wounds do, in public and loud. I watched him at the local bar, hands wrapped around a glass like a Salvation hubcap, eyes hollowed with a need to find blame. He'd always been the combustible one between us, a man prone to making choices and then regretting them like bad weather. Sometimes he punched walls. Sometimes he cried on my shoulder in the early hours, then left for the day like nothing had happened. In the middle of this, I went through Dad's things. The house he left behind was small, a Cape style with bay windows and a porch swing that squeaked, filled with the kind of accumulated objects that smell faintly of other lives. A pack of matches from a motel, a dog-eared paperback with an old receipt tucked inside, a stack of unpaid hospital bills weighted beneath a Bible with someone's name crossed out. The house smelled of fried onions and the kind of old tobacco that seems to linger forever. In the attic I found a shoebox tied with twine. Inside were documents, photographs, and a faded envelope labeled, "For Claire." My hands shook. Photos were of a younger Thomas with a woman I didn't recognize, smiling in front of a small house in Ohio, a child perched on his knee with a face I didn't know. Alongside the pictures were letters, carefully folded, each one bearing a sense of secrecy, or perhaps protection. I sat on the hardwood floor and read until the words blurred. He'd been paying for this child's school, he wrote. He'd been sending money in small amounts, using post office money orders, because he was ashamed to show his face but wanted to be responsible for something for once. He wrote that the child's mother, Maggie, a woman he'd met in Ohio before he left, had refused to take him back, that life had a way of fracturing even the strongest intentions. The more I read, the more my idea of my father like an iceberg shifted. There beneath the tip lay a whole glacier of hidden things, fractured relationships, secret attempts at redemption, anonymous generosity that he kept as private atonement. Why would he leave me everything? I muttered to the empty room, my voice bouncing back off rafters. Maybe because I was the one who showed up when he stuttered through his apologies. Maybe because his conscience had been nudging toward repair, and I was the one he thought could put glue where there had been splinters. Or maybe he simply wanted someone who remembered him not as a villain, but as a man who had erred. That afternoon, Mara barged in like a storm. "You hid this," she said, hurt filling her voice like a new instrument. "You knew he had another life. You knew and you kept it." "I didn't know anything about Maggie," I said. "I found these today, like you did." Her knees gave in a way that made her laugh like a sob. "Everything was a secret, Claire. This family was built on secrets. He left everything to you because you let him die in peace. That's what he has to offer us, peace. But peace doesn't buy back lost time." Evan, predictably, brought the county sheriff into the mix, not because he had a legitimate legal claim to the estate, but because he wanted any semblance of justice. "This isn't right," he kept saying, as if repeating it would make it true. I remember the day the official challenge came. A neighbor who had witnessed Dad's last days signed a statement saying she believed he was lucid and purposeful when he wrote the will. Another said he had been confused and weak, the kind of confusion that blurs agency. The truth is, wills are not moral compasses. They are instruments that can take a lifetime of hurt and reduce them to ink and paper. In the middle of this, the letters to me continued to unfold a man who had tried and failed and tried again in ways that were both ignoble and painfully human. He was not a hero. He was not a monster either. He was someone who had hurt us and then attempted to pay for his hurt in ways I took as inadequate and heartbreaking all at once. If you want to know how this ends, don't forget to subscribe. This isn't the ordinary kind of ending. I found myself at a crossroads. Keep the house and the inheritance and the burden of being the scapegoat for a family who'd been waiting to be justified, or walk away and let their claim of justice feel righteous. It was not an easy choice. And, of course, the legal part of it would be only the surface. The deeper parts, trust, memory, healing, would take infinitely longer. Choosing to keep the house felt less like an act of greed and more like an act of stewardship. I didn't want the estate for myself as much as I wanted a container for the truth, a place where stories could be laid out so they might be examined and perhaps altered. The town murmured. Mara wouldn't speak to me for a week. Evan swung between begging and berating, like tides dictated by someone else's moon. We entered into mediation because court looked like a scorched place where relationships go to die. The mediator was a woman named Patrice who chewed peppermint and had a way of getting to the heart of things with oddly practical questions. "What do you all want?" she asked simply, like a police officer asking the same thing of a group of tired witnesses. We answered in circling ways. Money, recognition, apology. "What does Claire want?" Patrice asked, eyes on me. I thought about inheritance like it was a stubborn animal with claws. "I want us to stop killing each other over the ghost of a man who didn't know how to be a father," I said. "I want to use whatever's there to take care of Evan, to make sure he can get treatment. I want a record of who he was, letters, photographs, everything. I want to know why he did what he did." There was anger and then a long, bone-deep exhaustion. "You want to be the keeper," Mara said, as if it were a choice between sainthood and theft. "You want redemption, Claire, and you think the money will buy it." What we didn't recognize was that the money couldn't buy anything except time and options. The letters, though, they could explain. An explanation, as brittle as it is, can sometimes act like salve. During a Sunday in March, under a thinning sun, I invited Mara and Evan to the house. They came without fans or lawyers, which is to say they came angry and tired. We sat in the living room where the light fell in like a late epiphany and read the letters aloud. The act of reading them together was a kind of ritual, an exorcism of narratives. One letter stood out. It was more than confession, an outline of responsibility. "If you read this," he had written, "then I am sorry that I left most of my debts and my silence behind. I cannot make up for the years, but I've tried to make amends in small ways. I'm leaving everything to Claire because she came back. I don't expect forgiveness. I ask only that you use this to help each other." He named Maggie and the child and left an instruction. "Half of any net estate is for Claire to use as she deems fit, a quarter is for Mara, a quarter held in trust for Evan. The trust would release funds if Evan engaged in a treatment program." We sat with that. Evan's face went hot and wet. "A trust," he said, voice breaking. "A trust is a cage." "It's a tether," I said. "It gives you a chance. It gives you help while you decide what to do." He punched his palm, because that's his language when he doesn't know how to speak. "I don't need you to make decisions for me, Claire." "None of us wanted those decisions," Mara said. "We wanted a father." Through the rawness we negotiated the practicalities. The lawyers' offices exchanged letters, the trust was established, and slowly, the communal fury cooled into an uneasy, smoldering truce. We didn't hug it out. We didn't suddenly become people who were healed. We became functionally adult about money in ways our father never was. Living in that house afterwards was like walking through a morgue of memories. Every room contained a fragment of the man who had left and the things he'd kept secret. The kitchen held a jar of coffee beans, half full, and a coffee stain on the table that had been there for a decade like a permanent bruise. I set the letters in a drawer and began the slow business of cataloging and cleaning. I repaired the porch swing with a tender attention I hadn't used on myself earlier. During late nights, those same nights when the laundromat downstairs hummed and the city felt wide and awake, I read more of Dad's letters. Some were tender, some were cruel. He'd been a gambler in ways that broke more than just his payday, and he'd been generous in weird, small ways. He'd paid for a kid's violin lessons in Ohio, and he'd left a sum that could make a dent in Evan's medical debt and still buy me a house free of mortgage. It was enough to create a foundation, literally and metaphorically. The real test came when I used the money not to flee but to build. I paid off Evan's outstanding hospital bills and used a portion of the inheritance to get him into a treatment program some distance away. It wasn't a cure. There is no quick fix for self-destruction. It was a bandage and a stepping stone. Mara accepted a small settlement and used it to move back to the city to go to night school. A decision none of us had predicted, but one that felt like the start of a slow amendment. "You're making it sound like a fairy tale," Mara said once, sarcasm lined with gratitude. "But thank you. I didn't feel like a heroine. I felt like someone trying to clean up a house after a storm, knowing the wallpaper would never quite match." The letters kept changing my relationship to the man who had left us. He had been more than a villain. He'd been also human, faltering, clumsy, sometimes profoundly remorseful in ways that would never repair what he'd broken. If this is resonating, share it with someone who needs to hear that family can be a battlefield and a refuge in the same heartbeat. The inheritance didn't buy me peace so much as it bought me a responsibility I couldn't walk away from. And at the center of that responsibility was an odd, stubborn hope that people can try to make amends and that sometimes, when they're gone, those attempts can be shaped into something useful. It's been 3 years since the funeral and the letters and the trust. The house on the corner now has curtains that match and a small garden where I plant rosemary and lavender because Dad once said he liked plants that smelled like memory. Evan completed a year-long treatment program and works part-time at a warehouse. He's not healed, who is? But his outbursts are less frequent, and he calls sometimes on Sundays when the light is gentle. Mara finished her degree at night and works at a non-profit that helps teenagers who grew up like we did. Hard, resourceful, volatile. She texts me photos of her life that don't always include grief. Did Dad's money fix everything?
Well,
did the revelation of his secret life with Maggie and the child erase the damage of his absence? Course not. But it did complicate the story we'd been telling ourselves. He was not a single-note villain. He was a man capable of both cruelty and surprising tenderness. He was flawed in the ordinary ways of people who had too many chances and not enough wisdom. We held a small reading one summer evening. I invited Mara and Evan and a few close friends. I read the letters aloud. Some parts that were raw, others that felt like old apologies. Afterward, we sat on the porch swing and drank tea made from the herbs I had planted. There were no epiphanies, no cinematic embraces. There were quiet confessions and small promises. I will try, I will show up, I will go to therapy. Why did he leave it all to you? Mara asked me at one point, in that kind of question where you ask the world and also yourself. I think, I answered slowly. He left it to me because he thought I would do something with it. Maybe fix what he couldn't. Maybe help without demanding a moral ledger. Maybe because, in the end, I was the only one who constantly showed up. My voice thinned. I don't know if that was the right decision. I only know it forced us to face things. We learned that the point of inheritance isn't always the money. Often it's the narrative it forces you to reckon with. The priest's announcement at the funeral had set us on a collision course with our own pasts. Money amplified everything, sure, but it also gave us an architecture to build something from the rubble. Some days the house is still a museum of pain. Other days it is where we hold dinners and have real conversations about sobriety and pay the electricians and argue about paint colors. Life is ordinary and also miraculous in its stubbornness. The trust funds still exist. They act like a cord tethering Evan to treatment and to a safety net we didn't possess before. My relationship with Mara remains careful. It has been rebuilt with a kind of scaffolding that prevents collapse more than it mends the original fracture. I don't regret keeping the house. I regret the parts of my father that led to the hurt he inflicted. But regret feels different from responsibility. Regret is private. Responsibility is active. I used the money to help my brother, to give my sister breathing room, and to document what Dad had left. His letters, his small acts, the evidence of a man trying and failing and trying again. I used it to fund a small scholarship at the community college for kids who had to work through school, because I remember what that felt like. The constant arithmetic of food versus books versus sleep. If this has touched something in you, please leave a comment. Has something like this ever happened to you? I'm reading everything. The lesson I carried away, over and over again like a hymn, is not tidy. People are complicated, and money won't erase the past. But money can be redirected into something that holds the possibility of repair. Forgiveness is not a one-time gift. It's an ongoing task. It doesn't absolve the past. It allows us to step into the future with clearer eyes. If I had to distill what the priest's words, "He left everything to you," meant, it would be this. Sometimes you are given a responsibility by someone who wronged you, and you must decide whether to be crushed by it or to use it to build a different life. The inheritance was less about possession and more about duty, less about reward and more about a tool to attempt healing. It didn't make my father a good man, but it gave me the chance to make something less broken out of the life he left behind. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear stories about the messy, beautiful work of rebuilding. And if you're carrying a similar weight, know this: grief and anger are valid. So is the choice to build from what's left. It may not feel like redemption. It may not feel like closure. But it will feel like trying, and sometimes that is enough to begin.